everyone. Miles here, and you're in for a wild ride. Welcome to a very special episode of Behind the Scams. And I do mean special, because if you're watching us on YouTube, you're in for a treat. Yep, you're not just hearing us today, you're seeing us animated. That's right. Nick, Sue, and yours truly have all been transformed into charming, mildly exaggerated cartoon versions of ourselves. Why? Because Stamp Out Scams is a scrappy little nonprofit with a big mission and a budget the size of a vending machine snack. So our fearless founder, Nick Henley, decided to put his tech skills to work, and voila, animated podcasts. Just like those way too perfect dating profile pics. Nick dusted off our best 1980s glamour shots. Big hair and baby smooth faces, courtesy of youth and Noxzema, to create these animated masterpieces. Who says you can't moonwalk back in time? Now, today's episode is one you absolutely can't miss. We're talking about a kind, retired truck driver from Minnesota who ends up in a jail cell in Mozambique. Wait, what? Yep, you heard that right. What started as a so-called inheritance opportunity led this unsuspecting man on a tragic journey across continents, only to be set up as a blind mule in a sophisticated drug trafficking scam. Think Nigerian prince meets international cartel, with a cruel twist. So buckle up, listeners and viewers, because this one's got it all. Fake inheritances, forged legal documents, exotic destinations, and a terrifying dose of international injustice. And remember, the stories are real, the voices are real, and the animation is just the sugar on top. Now, let's toss it over to Sue, our host for today's episode on Behind the Scams. Take it away, Sue.
Thank you, Miles. It's so great to see you, and I mean that quite literally now that we have an animated version of our podcast showing on the YouTube channel for Stamp Out Scams, appropriately named Scam TV. Fantastic work as always. Now on to our latest and greatest podcast episode. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Scams. I'm your host, Sue, and as always, I'm joined by my husband and co-host, Nick. But before I turn on Nick's microphone, let's address the animated elephant in the room. Yes, our cartoon selves look like we just graduated college. That's not a glitch. That's poetic license. A little digital Botox never hurt anyone. Honestly, wouldn't you take a few years off if you could? I told the artist who did our renderings, give me the waistline I deserve and a smile to match. I mean, come on, who needs Ozempic when we have animation? Okay, Nick, now it's time to get serious. Today we're diving into something really disturbing, a case that highlights just how sophisticated and dangerous modern scams can become. We're looking at what's known as a blind mule drug trafficking scam.
Blind Mule? I've heard of drug mules before, but what makes this one blind?
That's exactly what makes this case so troubling, Nick. A blind mule is someone who unknowingly transports illegal substances or contraband across borders. They have no idea they're part of a criminal operation.
Oh, wow. That's terrifying. So we're talking about completely innocent people being set up to take the fall for drug trafficking?
Exactly. And today we're diving into the heartbreaking case of Rodney Baldus, a retired truck driver from Minnesota who thought he was about to receive an inheritance from his late wife.
Wait, so how does an inheritance lead to someone becoming a drug mule? That seems like quite a leap.
That's the brilliance and the horror of these scams. The criminals create these elaborate stories that seem legitimate. In Rodney's case, they told him the inheritance was in Italy, but he needed to travel to Africa first to sign some papers.
Let me guess, that trip to Africa didn't end well.
Not at all. Rodney is currently sitting in a crowded jail cell in Mozambique with virtually no hope of getting out. His daughter Nicole is absolutely terrified for her father, who's diabetic and facing dire conditions.
That's absolutely heartbreaking. No one expects to end up in a foreign prison when they're pursuing what they think is a legitimate inheritance.
And that's why we need to talk about this case today, to help our listeners understand how these scams work and how to avoid becoming victims themselves. So let's dive deeper into Rodney Baldus's story. Rodney is a 68-year-old retired truck driver from Minnesota who spent his life on the road, working hard to provide for his family. After losing his wife, he was understandably devastated.
I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for him. So at what point did the scammers approach him?
The scammers targeted him during this vulnerable period of grief. They contacted him claiming they had discovered an inheritance that belonged to his late wife, a substantial sum that was apparently being held in Italy.
That's interesting. Did they explain why he hadn't heard about this inheritance before? I mean, wouldn't something like that have been part of her will or estate planning?
That's exactly what makes these scammers so cunning, Nick. They created an elaborate story about how this money had been in a dormant account and that his wife may not have even known about it. They presented themselves as a legitimate financial institution that specializes in finding unclaimed assets.
Oh, I see. So they played on both his grief and the hope of having this unexpected financial windfall. But how did they convince him to go to Africa? That seems like a pretty big red flag right there.
You'd think so, but they had a very plausible explanation. They told Rodney that before he could access the funds in Italy, he needed to sign some special paperwork with a specific notary in Mozambique who handled these kinds of international inheritance claims.
Wait a minute. Mozambique? Not exactly on the way to Italy from Minnesota.
Exactly. But here's the key to how they lowered his defenses. They covered all his travel expenses, first-class tickets, luxury hotel accommodations, private drivers, the works.
I get it now. If someone's paying for everything, it seems less like a scam because you're not out of pocket, right?
Precisely. When someone's spending money on you rather than asking for money, it flips the typical scam warning signs upside down.
So what exactly happened when Rodney arrived in Mozambique?
According to what his daughter Nicole has shared, he was greeted at the airport by someone claiming to be a representative from the financial institution. They took him to his hotel, helped him get settled, and told him they'd return the next day to take him to sign the paperwork.
And I'm guessing that's when things started to go wrong?
Yes. The next morning, before his scheduled meeting, local police raided his hotel room and found a significant amount of drugs hidden in the lining of the suitcase the representatives had given him to use for his trip to Italy afterward.
Oh my God, so they actually planted the drugs in his luggage from the beginning? That's absolutely horrifying.
It appears that way, and now Rodney is facing serious drug trafficking charges in a foreign country where he doesn't speak the language, doesn't understand the legal system, and has very limited access to proper representation.
I'm curious about one thing, Sue. How did his daughter Nicole find out what happened? I mean, if he was arrested in Mozambique, how did the family even know?
Rodney was allowed one brief phone call, which he used to contact Nicole. She said he was distraught, confused, and terrified. He kept saying there must be some mistake, that he was just there to sign inheritance papers before going to Italy.
This is just heartbreaking. A retired man thinking he's about to receive some good news after losing his wife and instead ends up in a foreign prison cell.
And that's what makes these blind mule scams so effective and so devastating. The victims never suspect they're being used as drug couriers because the story they're told seems legitimate and carefully crafted to appeal to their specific circumstances. Let's talk about how these scammers actually convinced Rodney that this inheritance was legitimate. The psychological tactics they used are actually quite sophisticated.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that. I mean, most of us have received those ridiculous emails about foreign inheritances, but we delete them immediately. How did they make this one seem so believable?
Well, first of all, they did their homework. These weren't just random emails. The scammers likely researched Rodney's background, knew about his wife's passing, and crafted a story specifically designed to target him during his vulnerable state of grief.
So they personalized the approach rather than sending a generic scam message. That makes sense.
Exactly. They claimed that his wife had a distant relative in Italy who had passed away, leaving a substantial estate worth approximately $3.7 million. And because his wife was supposedly the last living relative, the inheritance would pass to Rodney.
$3.7 million? That's a life-changing amount. I can see how that would get someone's attention, especially someone who's worked hard their whole life as a truck driver.
Absolutely. And here's another psychological tactic they used. They didn't ask for money up front. Instead, they positioned themselves as helping him claim what was rightfully his. They sent official-looking documents with watermarks, legal terminology, and even forged signatures from supposed Italian banking officials.
Oh, wow. So they put significant effort into making the paperwork look legitimate. I'm guessing they might have even used real law firm or bank names?
That's right, Nick. They often co-opt the names of real institutions to add credibility, and they maintained consistent communication over several months, building trust gradually before ever mentioning the trip to Africa.
Several months? So this wasn't a rushed job. They were playing the long game.
Precisely. They built rapport and trust over time. When they finally mentioned the African connection, they had a compelling story ready. They told Rodney that because of the international nature of the inheritance, he needed to meet with a specialized financial representative in Mozambique who handled cross-border estates.
And I'm guessing that's when they mentioned the all-expenses-paid trip.
Yes, and that's such a crucial psychological element. They told Rodney that the estate would cover all travel expenses as part of the processing fees, first-class airfare, luxury accommodations, and all meals included.
Which completely goes against what we typically warn people about with scams, right? Usually we say, if someone asks you for money, that's a red flag. But here they're actually spending money on their victim.
That's exactly it. It reverses the usual warning signs, and it creates what psychologists call reciprocity. When someone does something for us, we feel obligated to trust them or do something in return. It's a powerful psychological trigger.
I never thought about it that way. So by paying for everything, they're actually building more trust, not less.
Right, and there's also the exclusivity factor. They told Rodney this was a special procedure for high-value international estates. Making something seem exclusive or unique can bypass our normal skepticism.
I see. And I'm guessing the story about needing to sign papers in Africa first before going to Italy had some convincing rationale too?
Absolutely. They created an elaborate explanation about how Mozambique had special financial treaties with both the U.S. and Italy that made it the perfect intermediary location for processing these types of inheritances. They even sent him links to real treaties and legal agreements that seemed to support their claims.
That's really devious. And I'm assuming if he questioned anything, they had ready answers?
They were prepared for every question. If he expressed concern about the Africa detour, they would emphasize it was just a short stop before Italy, where the actual money was. They created artificial urgency, too, saying the inheritance would revert to the Italian government if not claimed within a certain time frame.
Oh, that's another classic manipulation tactic, right? Creating urgency so people don't have time to think critically or consult others?
Exactly. They don't want you talking to family members or financial advisors who might spot the red flags. They isolated him in his decision-making.
So they paid for everything, sent convincing documentation, established trust over time, created a sense of urgency, and had answers for every potential question. It's like they covered all the psychological bases.
That's exactly what makes these scams so effective. They're not just targeting financial resources, they're specifically engineered to bypass our natural psychological defenses against fraud.
When you lay it all out like that, it becomes easier to understand how someone like Rodney could fall for it. These scammers are essentially psychological manipulators.
They absolutely are. And that's what makes these blind mule scams particularly sinister. They don't just steal money, they potentially ruin people's lives by turning them into unwitting drug traffickers. Let's talk about what exactly a blind mule is, because this term is really critical to understanding what happened to Rodney and how these scams operate.
Yeah, I've heard that term before, but I'm not entirely sure what it means in this context. Is it different from a regular drug mule?
Great question, Nick. A traditional drug mule knowingly and intentionally transports drugs across borders for payment, taking on that risk deliberately. A blind mule, on the other hand, has no idea they're carrying contraband.
So, they're completely innocent? They don't know what they're involved in?
Exactly. These are normal, law-abiding citizens who have been manipulated into carrying drugs, money, or other illegal items without their knowledge or consent. In Rodney's case, he genuinely believed he was traveling for legitimate purposes related to his wife's inheritance.
That's absolutely terrifying. How do the traffickers actually get the drugs on the person without them knowing?
They use several methods. Sometimes they might hide drugs in gifts they ask the person to carry for them. Other times, they'll secretly place the drugs in the victim's luggage when they're not paying attention. In more elaborate schemes like Rodney's, they might even provide the victim with new luggage that has drugs hidden in the lining or structure of the bag itself.
Oh wow, so the victim might be using a suitcase that was compromised from the beginning? That's incredibly devious.
It is. And in Rodney's case, investigators believe that's exactly what happened. The scammers likely provided him with a new suitcase as part of his all-expenses-paid travel package, and that suitcase had drugs professionally concealed within its structure.
I'm trying to put myself in Rodney's shoes. He's this retired truck driver who thinks he's just going through normal travel procedures, and suddenly he's arrested for drug trafficking. The shock must be overwhelming.
The psychological trauma is immense. These victims go from thinking they're about to receive a life-changing inheritance to suddenly finding themselves in a foreign prison, sometimes facing decades of incarceration or even the death penalty in countries with strict drug laws.
What types of people do these trafficking networks typically target for blind mule operations? Is there a pattern?
They often look for specific vulnerabilities. Elderly individuals who may be less familiar with international scams are common targets. People who have recently experienced loss, like Rodney with his wife's passing, are also prime targets because grief can cloud judgment.
I can see how being in an emotionally vulnerable state would make someone more susceptible.
Definitely. They also target people with financial needs but clean records, often retirees, people who've been laid off, or those facing significant medical bills. The victims typically have no criminal history, which makes them less likely to be flagged by customs officials.
That makes sense from the trafficker's perspective. Someone with no criminal record probably wouldn't raise suspicions at border control.
Exactly. And that's crucial to understanding how calculated these operations are. Drug trafficking organizations specifically select people who fit certain profiles, often older individuals from Western countries who would not typically be suspected as drug couriers.
So in many ways, the trafficking networks are exploiting racial and age-based assumptions that border agents might have.
That's a great observation, Nick. They're absolutely counting on those biases. A 65-year-old white grandfather from Minnesota doesn't fit the profile that many border agents are trained to look for when it comes to drug trafficking.
And I'm guessing once the person is caught, the real traffickers just disappear?
They vanish completely. All contact information suddenly becomes inactive. phone numbers are disconnected, email addresses stop working, and any supposed lawyers or financial advisors the victim was communicating with simply cease to exist.
Leaving the victim completely alone in a foreign country facing serious charges? That's devastating.
It's truly heartbreaking, and what makes it even worse is that many legal systems around the world operate on a principle where possession equals guilt. The fact that drugs were found in your possession is often enough for a conviction, regardless of whether you knew about them.
So even if Rodney maintains his innocence and explains that he was tricked, that might not be enough to save him?
Unfortunately, that's correct. In many countries, including Mozambique, where Rodney is being held, there's often little sympathy for claims of being an unwitting participant. The burden of proof falls on the accused to somehow prove they didn't know, which is incredibly difficult to do.
This makes me think about how many innocent people might be sitting in prisons around the world right now because they fell victim to these scams.
The numbers are difficult to track precisely because many cases go unreported or unidentified as blind mule situations, but experts estimate there are hundreds, if not thousands, of blind mules currently incarcerated worldwide.
And I'd imagine these criminals are constantly evolving their tactics as awareness increases.
Absolutely. The inheritance angle is just one approach. They also use romance scams, business opportunity schemes, or even fake humanitarian missions to lure in victims. The core deception remains the same, getting an innocent person to unwittingly transport illegal substances, but the stories they use to accomplish that goal are constantly evolving. Let's talk about Rodney's current situation, which is frankly quite dire. Right now, he's imprisoned in a severely overcrowded jail in Mozambique.
What are the conditions like there? I can't imagine they're anything close to what we'd consider humane in the U.S.
You're right to be concerned, Nick. According to reports we've received, Rodney is in a cell designed for maybe 8 people that's currently housing over 30 inmates. There's virtually no privacy, extremely limited access to basic hygiene, and he's sleeping on a concrete floor with just a thin mat.
Oh my God, that's horrific. And given his age, he's what, in his 60s?
He's 65, and that's exactly what makes this situation even more concerning. At his age, these conditions would be difficult for anyone to endure, but Rodney also has diabetes, which complicates everything tremendously.
I was going to ask about that. How is he managing his diabetes in prison? That requires regular medication and monitoring, right?
That's the biggest concern his daughter Nicole has right now. Rodney requires daily insulin, and while he did have some medication with him when he was arrested, those supplies quickly ran out. The prison doesn't provide consistent medical care, and what they do offer is nowhere near adequate for managing a condition like diabetes.
That sounds potentially life-threatening. Is he getting any insulin at all now?
It's sporadic at best. Nicole has been trying desperately to ensure her father receives his medication, but there are enormous bureaucratic hurdles. Sometimes she can arrange for local contacts to deliver insulin, but there's no guarantee it reaches him or that it's properly stored before administration.
This is just heartbreaking. What about food? I know diet is crucial for diabetics.
The prison provides only basic meals, usually just rice and beans, sometimes with a small amount of fish or meat. It's completely inadequate for someone who needs to carefully manage their blood sugar. Rodney has reportedly lost over 30 pounds since his imprisonment began.
30 pounds? That's alarming. Has Nicole been able to visit him at all?
She's made 2 incredibly difficult and expensive trips to Mozambique, but even then, she was only allowed to see him for about 15 minutes each time, with guards present. The financial burden on her has been enormous. International flights, accommodations, hiring local translators and fixers who can navigate the system.
I can't even imagine how helpless she must feel. What about diplomatic assistance? Is the U.S. government helping at all?
This is where things get even more frustrating. While the U.S. Embassy is aware of Rodney's case, their hands are largely tied when it comes to drug charges in foreign countries. They can ensure he's not being mistreated beyond the standard conditions, which are already terrible by our standards, but they can't interfere in another country's legal process.
So what does that mean for his legal situation? Is there any movement on his case?
The legal process in Mozambique moves excruciatingly slowly. Rodney has been detained for over 8 months now without a formal trial date. His court-appointed attorney speaks limited English, and communication is a major challenge. Nicole has been trying to hire a private attorney who specializes in these cases, but the costs are astronomical.
Wait, 8 months without even a trial date? That's unbelievable.
Unfortunately, it's not uncommon in these situations, and the really heartbreaking part is that Rodney was just days away from retiring completely. He had worked hard his entire life as a truck driver, saved responsibly, and was looking forward to spending time with his grandchildren. Now he's facing potentially 20 years in prison if convicted.
That's devastating. How is he holding up mentally through all of this?
According to Nicole, her father oscillates between periods of deep depression and brief moments of hope. The psychological toll is immense. He feels profound guilt for falling for the scam and putting his family through this ordeal. There's also the cultural and language isolation. He doesn't speak Portuguese, which is the primary language in Mozambique.
I'm thinking about the medical situation again. What happens if his diabetes goes uncontrolled for too long?
That's Nicole's greatest fear. Uncontrolled diabetes can lead to a host of serious complications: kidney failure, vision loss, cardiovascular problems, and in severe cases, diabetic ketoacidosis, which can be fatal. Without proper medical care, Rodney is at serious risk for these complications.
This just sounds like a nightmare that keeps getting worse. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel for him?
It's a difficult road ahead. Nicole has started a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for legal fees and has been working with an advocacy group that specializes in helping Americans detained abroad. But these cases are notoriously difficult to resolve, especially when drugs are involved.
It really drives home how devastating these blind mule scams are. One moment of trust can literally destroy someone's life.
Exactly, and that's why sharing these stories is so important. Rodney's situation serves as a heartbreaking reminder of just how high the stakes really are when it comes to these sophisticated scams. To better understand how these blind mule operations work, we relied on some of the fantastic work done by vanZeller, an investigative journalist who hosts National Geographic's show Trafficked. She's spent years infiltrating and documenting global trafficking networks.
Oh, we both know that name. She's fantastic, and we are actually addicted to her show and to her work. We really encourage our listeners to watch her show, Trafficked. She really gets deep into these criminal organizations, right?
Absolutely. What makes Mariana's reporting so valuable is that she's actually sat down with people who run these operations. In her reporting, she explained that these blind mule scams are just one small part of much larger, sophisticated criminal enterprises.
You know, Sue, this story is very similar to the podcast episode we did on the 80-year-old woman named Glenda, who became a money mule for Nigerian scammers and who was eventually charged with federal crimes for her involvement with the romance scam ring. It's episode 8 of our podcast for those who want to give it a listen. So how do these networks typically operate? Are they as organized as we might imagine?
More organized than most people would believe. According to Mariana's reporting, these aren't just loose associations of criminals. They're structured like multinational corporations. They have specialized departments handling recruitment, logistics, money laundering, and even what you might call crisis management.
Crisis management? What does that entail?
Essentially, they have plans in place for when things go wrong. If a mule gets caught like Rodney, they have protocols to immediately distance themselves, destroy evidence, and sometimes even arrange legal representation that's secretly working for them, not the victim.
That's disturbing. And I'm guessing they specifically look for people like Rodney, ordinary folks who don't fit the profile of a drug smuggler?
Exactly. Mariana explained that recruiters are trained to identify vulnerable targets. They look for specific indicators that someone might be susceptible. Recent widowers like Rodney, people facing financial difficulties, retirees looking to supplement their income, or just lonely individuals seeking connection.
So they're essentially profiling potential victims. What makes retired people particularly attractive targets?
Several factors. First, retirees often have time for travel. Second, they typically don't have work commitments tying them down. Third, many are living on fixed incomes and might be attracted to opportunities for additional money. But perhaps most importantly, they generally have clean records and don't match the profile that border security might be looking for.
I never thought about that last part. I suppose a 65-year-old retired truck driver from Minnesota doesn't exactly scream international drug trafficker.
That's precisely the point. Believe it or not, drug cartels will specifically instruct their recruiters to find what they call perfect profiles, people who raise absolutely no red flags with customs officials.
How do they gain these people's trust so completely? I'm trying to understand how someone like Rodney gets from "I might have an inheritance" to boarding a plane to Africa.
It's a gradual process that Mariana refers to as the slow boil. They don't immediately ask the person to transport drugs. The relationship might begin months earlier with something completely legitimate. In Rodney's case, the inheritance story.
So they're playing the long game.
Absolutely. They invest considerable time establishing credibility. They might send official-looking documents, arrange video calls with people posing as attorneys or bank officials, even create fake websites for law firms or financial institutions that look completely legitimate.
That level of sophistication is scary. How international are these operations?
Incredibly, a single Blind Mule operation might involve people working from 5 or 6 different countries. The person who initially contacts the victim might be in one country. The money might move through banks in another. The actual contraband comes from somewhere else, and the ultimate destination is yet another place.
That must make it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track.
It creates jurisdictional nightmares. No single country's police force can effectively investigate the entire network. And these organizations are constantly adapting their methods based on law enforcement strategies.
What about the people who actually recruit victims like Rodney? Are they high-level criminals or just pawns themselves?
That's a fascinating question. Many recruiters are former victims themselves. In some cases, people who get caught trafficking can reduce their sentences by recruiting new mules. It creates this terrible cycle where victims become perpetrators out of desperation.
Oh wow, that's twisted. So they know exactly how devastating this experience is, and they're still willing to inflict it on someone else.
It speaks to the psychological manipulation these organizations employ. Many recruiters convince themselves they're offering an opportunity, not setting someone up for disaster. Some even believe the lies about minimal risk themselves.
How do they typically introduce the transportation element? I mean, at some point they have to get the victim to agree to carry something, right?
There are a few common approaches. Sometimes they'll present it as a simple favor. While you're traveling anyway, could you drop this package off for my business associate? In other cases, they might claim it's documentation related to the inheritance or business opportunity, or they might hide the contraband in gifts or souvenirs they give the victim.
In Rodney's case, did he know he was carrying anything at all?
Based on everything we know, Rodney had no idea. The drugs were hidden in the lining of a gift he was asked to deliver. This is what makes the Blind Mule scenario so devastating. The victim genuinely has no knowledge of their participation in a crime.
So they're truly innocent, yet facing the full legal consequences. That's horrifying.
It is. And Nick, you'll find this interesting. Having worked in federal law enforcement for so long, these networks typically have contacts within local law enforcement in the destination countries. Sometimes the arrest itself is part of the plan, creating a distraction while larger shipments go through undetected.
Oh no, nothing worse than dirty law enforcement. So you're saying Rodney might have been a sacrificial pawn? They intended for him to get caught?
It's entirely possible. As sad as it may sound, there has been documented cases where trafficking organizations deliberately sacrifice one courier carrying a small amount to divert attention from much larger shipments.
That's genuinely evil. Do these networks have any conscience at all?
It is evil. And to make matters even worse, these organizations view blind mules as disposable resources, not as human beings. They calculate the cost of recruitment against the potential profits and accept certain losses as just the cost of doing business. Let's talk about the red flags that Rodney might have missed in this situation, because there were definitely warning signs that could have protected him.
Absolutely. I'm thinking the most obvious one was this inheritance from a wife he didn't know had assets in Italy. That sounds pretty suspicious right off the bat.
Exactly. Any unexpected inheritance, especially from a foreign country, should immediately raise questions. But what makes these scams so effective is that they gradually normalize the abnormal. They start with something that might seem plausible. Maybe his wife did have family connections in Italy that he wasn't aware of.
And then they build on that initial acceptance, right? Each small step seems reasonable after you've accepted the premise.
That's exactly right. Another major red flag was the requirement to travel to Africa first, before Italy. There's simply no legitimate reason why Rodney would need to physically sign papers in Africa for an Italian inheritance.
That geographical inconsistency is huge. I mean, if you think about it logically, why would Italian inheritance documents need to be signed in Mozambique?
Absolutely. And then there's the all expenses paid travel. In legitimate business or legal matters, you typically pay your own way, or the costs come out of your potential proceeds.
Free international travel is definitely something to be wary of. I mean, there's no such thing as a free lunch, let alone a free international flight.
Right. When someone else is covering significant expenses like international airfare, accommodations, and meals, you have to ask yourself, what's their incentive? What are they getting out of this arrangement that makes it worth thousands of dollars to them?
So, what other red flags should our listeners be watching for if they're approached with something similar?
Time pressure is a big one. Scammers often create artificial deadlines or urgency. The inheritance will revert to the state if you don't claim it by next month, or this opportunity won't last long.
Oh, that makes sense. Creating urgency prevents people from taking time to think critically or consult with others.
Exactly. Another warning sign is requests for secrecy. Rodney was probably told not to discuss this opportunity with family, friends, or financial advisors, supposedly for privacy or security reasons.
I've heard that before in other scams. Don't tell your family yet. Surprise them when it's all finalized. That kind of thing?
Precisely. Isolation is a key manipulation tactic. They want to cut victims off from people who might raise concerns or point out inconsistencies.
What about requests to transport items? That seems like an obvious red flag.
Absolutely. Being asked to carry packages, documents, or gifts for someone else should immediately raise concerns. Legitimate businesses have established shipping channels. They don't need random travelers to transport important items.
And I imagine the explanations for why you need to carry something are often pretty flimsy when you really think about them.
They typically are. It's cheaper than shipping, or it's too valuable to trust to courier services are common explanations that don't hold up to scrutiny. International shipping services exist precisely for sending items between countries securely.
So what about communication methods? Are there red flags there too?
Definitely. Scammers often prefer communication platforms that are difficult to trace or verify. They might start with email, but quickly move to messaging apps with encryption or that automatically delete messages. They avoid official channels like registered mail from established firms.
And I'm guessing the documentation itself often has telltale signs, right?
Good point. Legitimate legal or financial documents have consistent formatting, no spelling or grammatical errors, and proper letterhead. Scammers often create impressive-looking documents, but close inspection usually reveals inconsistencies or mistakes.
What about verification? I mean, could Rodney have checked if this inheritance was legitimate?
That's another crucial step people miss. Any legitimate inheritance claim can be verified through official channels. You can contact the embassy of the country involved, hire a local attorney in that jurisdiction, or check with probate courts. Scammers count on people not taking these verification steps.
And I imagine they also create fake websites and phone numbers to verify their claims if the victim does try to check?
Exactly. They might set up elaborate fake law firm websites or have accomplices answer verification calls. That's why it's important to find verification sources independently, not using contact information provided by the potential scammers.
This all seems so obvious when we lay it out like this, but I can see how someone could miss these signs in the moment, especially when they're grieving or financially vulnerable.
That's what makes these scams so effective. They target people at vulnerable moments and exploit normal human psychology. Most people want to believe good things are happening to them. We're naturally inclined to trust, not to suspect everyone of criminal intent.
So, what's the single most important thing our listeners should remember to avoid becoming a blind mule?
Never, under any circumstances, agree to transport items across international borders for someone else, especially someone you've only met recently or online. There is simply no scenario where this is worth the risk.
And I'm guessing another good rule is, if it sounds too good to be true, like a surprise inheritance or an all-expenses-paid international trip, it probably is.
That's the golden rule of scam prevention. Legitimate opportunities rarely fall into your lap without effort, and they don't require you to take unusual actions like traveling to foreign countries or carrying packages for strangers. You know, Nick, Rodney's case isn't isolated. We've seen this same pattern play out with alarming frequency around the world.
Really? Are there other documented cases similar to Rodney's situation that you can share with our listeners?
Absolutely. One case that comes to mind is Maria Hernandez, a 62-year-old widow from Florida. She met someone online who claimed to be a wealthy businessman. After months of building a relationship, he told her he had sent her an expensive gift, but needed her to travel to Colombia to pick it up due to customs complications.
Let me guess. There was no gift waiting for her in Colombia?
Exactly. When she arrived, she was given a suitcase that supposedly contained artwork and collectibles. Colombian authorities found nearly 5 kilograms of cocaine hidden in the lining of the suitcase. She spent 3 years in prison before evidence of the online relationship helped prove she was an unwitting participant.
That's devastating. 3 years of her life just gone. Do these scammers typically target older individuals?
They do often target older adults, but not exclusively. In 2019, there was a college student from Michigan who was offered a study abroad opportunity in Thailand with all expenses paid. All he had to do was bring back some local handicrafts for the sponsoring organization.
Oh no, what happened to him?
He was arrested at Bangkok airport with 2 suitcases containing hidden compartments filled with methamphetamine. His case garnered international attention because of his age, just 21 years old. He was facing the death penalty, but diplomatic intervention eventually reduced his sentence to 25 years.
These stories are heartbreaking. I'm noticing a pattern, though. The scammers seem to customize their approach based on the victim's circumstances and vulnerabilities.
That's exactly right. For retirees, it's often inheritances or investment opportunities. For young people, it might be job offers, educational opportunities, or even romance. The details change, but the core strategy remains the same. Build trust, offer something the victim wants, and then use them as an unwitting courier.
I'm curious about how these scams evolve over time. Do they adapt their tactics as awareness grows?
They're constantly evolving. 5 years ago, most Blind Mule cases involved direct drug trafficking. Now we're seeing more sophisticated schemes involving money laundering, where victims are asked to open bank accounts or carry cash that's part of a larger laundering operation.
That makes sense. Cash might raise fewer immediate red flags than a mysterious package.
Exactly. We're also seeing an increase in what law enforcement calls layered recruitment, where the person who builds the relationship with the victim isn't directly connected to the trafficking organization.
So like a middleman who might not even know they're recruiting for a drug trafficking ring?
Precisely. There might be 2 or 3 degrees of separation between the person chatting with a potential victim online and the actual criminal organization. This makes these networks incredibly difficult to track and dismantle.
What about geographic patterns? Are there certain routes or countries that come up frequently in these cases?
Great question. We definitely see certain patterns. Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia remains a hotspot. South America, especially Colombia, Peru, and Brazil, is another common region. And increasingly, we're seeing cases in West African nations like Nigeria, Ghana, and as in Rodney's case, Mozambique.
And I'm guessing the destinations are typically countries with strict drug laws and harsh penalties?
That's one of the most sinister aspects of these scams. The criminal organizations deliberately send mules to countries where penalties are severe. They're essentially gambling with people's lives.
That's chilling. What about the methods of contact? How do these scammers initially find their victims?
Social media has become the primary recruitment ground. Dating apps, Facebook, Instagram, anywhere people share personal details that scammers can use to craft targeted approaches. But we're also seeing recruitment through legitimate-seeming job postings on sites like LinkedIn or Indeed.
Wow, so they're really infiltrating platforms we all use daily. Are there any particularly creative or unusual Blind Mule scams you've come across?
One case that stands out involved a children's charity that was actually a front for a drug trafficking organization. They recruited volunteers to deliver medical supplies to children in need in various countries. The supplies were real, but hidden among them were drugs. The organization operated for nearly 3 years before authorities caught on.
That's horrifying, using children's welfare as a cover. These people truly have no moral boundaries.
None whatsoever, and that's what makes them so dangerous. They're willing to destroy innocent lives like Rodney's without a second thought.
It sounds like no matter how the specific approach changes, the fundamental structure of using unwitting participants to take the fall remains consistent.
Absolutely. The window dressing changes, but the core deception remains the same. They offer something desirable, whether that's love, money, adventure, or the chance to do good. They build trust over time, and then they exploit that trust in a way that leaves the victim holding the bag, literally.
And I imagine by the time the victim realizes what's happening, it's too late?
Usually, yes. By the time they're standing in front of customs officials or local police, the people who recruited them have vanished completely, and the victim is left trying to explain a situation that sounds implausible even to their own ears. Now, let's talk about the legal challenges that blind mules like Rodney face. The situation is incredibly complicated, especially when you're dealing with foreign legal systems.
I can only imagine. What kind of legal support do American citizens typically receive when they're caught in situations like this abroad?
Unfortunately, much less than most people expect. While U.S. embassies and consulates can provide lists of local attorneys and notify family members, they can't actually provide legal representation or pay legal fees.
Wait, really? I think a lot of our listeners might assume that if they got into trouble overseas, the U.S. government would step in more forcefully.
That's a common misconception. The embassy can ensure the detained person isn't being mistreated according to local standards and that they're being afforded the same rights as local citizens, but they can't interfere with another country's legal processes.
That's pretty scary. So someone like Rodney is essentially at the mercy of Mozambique's legal system?
Exactly. And many of these countries have legal systems that function very differently from what Americans are familiar with. In some places, the presumption of innocence we take for granted in the U.S. doesn't exist in the same way.
You mean you might be presumed guilty until proven innocent?
In practice, yes, and burden of proof works differently too. In Rodney's case, the physical evidence is compelling. He was caught with drugs. The fact that he didn't know about them is extraordinarily difficult to prove.
That's a terrifying position to be in. How do you prove you didn't know something was there?
That's exactly the problem. It becomes a nearly impossible burden, and often these cases rely heavily on testimony from the accused, which can be problematic when there are language barriers or when statements are taken without legal representation present.
Are there specialized attorneys who handle these kinds of cases for Americans abroad?
There are international criminal defense attorneys who specialize in these situations, but their services are extremely expensive. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in many cases, and families like Nicole's often don't have those kinds of resources.
Oh, wow. So families are facing not only the emotional trauma, but also potentially devastating financial costs?
Absolutely. And even with the best legal representation, the outcomes are often still grim. Many countries have mandatory minimum sentences for drug trafficking that judges have no discretion to reduce, even in cases where they might believe the defendant was deceived.
What about diplomatic negotiations? Can the State Department negotiate for their release?
In high-profile cases or with certain allies, diplomatic pressure can sometimes help. But it's not something families should count on. The State Department generally respects the sovereignty of other nations' legal systems, and drug trafficking cases aren't typically prioritized for diplomatic intervention.
That's disheartening. Are there any international treaties or agreements that protect people in these situations?
Not really. While there are prisoner transfer treaties that might eventually allow someone to serve their sentence in the U.S., those typically only kick in after conviction, and not all countries participate in these agreements.
So even if Rodney is eventually convicted, he might have to serve his entire sentence in Mozambique?
That's a very real possibility, and prison conditions in many of these countries are extremely harsh by American standards. Overcrowding, limited access to medical care, poor sanitation, these are common issues that make survival, especially for someone with diabetes like Rodney, a daily struggle.
That's absolutely terrifying. Are there any non-governmental organizations that help in these situations?
There are a few nonprofits that provide support, like Prisoners Abroad and the Fair Trials Organization. They can offer guidance to families and sometimes provide humanitarian assistance to the detained person, but their resources are limited.
What about proving that the person was actually scammed? Can investigators trace communications or money transfers to show that the person was being manipulated?
In theory, yes, but practical realities make this difficult. Local authorities may not have the resources or motivation to conduct that kind of investigation. Electronic evidence might be on servers in other countries, and the scammers are sophisticated about covering their tracks.
It sounds like the deck is really stacked against victims like Rodney.
It truly is. And there's another layer of complexity. These cases often fall into a gray area where multiple jurisdictions are involved. The scammers might be operating from one country, the recruitment happened over the internet, and the arrest occurred in yet another country.
So nobody takes full responsibility for investigating the broader criminal network?
Exactly. Local authorities are often focused narrowly on the crime that occurred in their jurisdiction, the possession or transportation of drugs. They have little incentive to expand investigations internationally.
This is all so frustrating. It seems like the perfect crime. The scammers face minimal risk while the victims bear all the consequences.
That's what makes these schemes so insidious and why they continue to work. The legal barriers to proving innocence, combined with the lack of robust international cooperation in investigating these networks, creates a perfect storm where justice is rarely served.
For families like Nicole's, what options do they have to fight for their loved ones?
They can hire local counsel, reach out to their congressional representatives to apply pressure on the State Department, work with nonprofits, and try to generate media attention. But each of these paths is difficult and offers no guarantees.
And I'm guessing these legal proceedings can drag on for years?
They often do. The combination of overburdened court systems, language barriers, and complex international components means these cases rarely move quickly. Some victims spend years in pretrial detention before their cases are even heard. Beyond the legal challenges we just discussed, I think it's important to address the devastating psychological impact these situations have on both the victims and their families.
Absolutely. I can't even begin to imagine what Rodney and his daughter Nicole are going through right now.
The psychological trauma is multi-layered. For Rodney, there's the immediate shock of arrest and imprisonment in a foreign country where he likely doesn't speak the language. Then comes the realization that he's been deceived by people he trusted.
That betrayal of trust must be crushing. I mean, these scammers spend weeks or months building relationships with their victims, right?
Exactly. They establish rapport and create a sense of trust before springing the trap. So victims like Rodney aren't just dealing with the physical hardship of imprisonment, but also profound feelings of betrayal, humiliation, and self-blame.
I imagine there's a lot of, "How could I have been so stupid?" going through their minds.
Absolutely. The self-recrimination can be overwhelming. Many victims replay every conversation, every decision point in their minds, torturing themselves about what they could have done differently. And prison environments, especially in developing countries, can be psychologically devastating in themselves.
The isolation alone must be terrifying. Being cut off from everything familiar, everyone who cares about you.
And for someone like Rodney who has diabetes, there's the constant fear about your health and survival. Will you get your medication? What happens if you have a medical emergency? These fears create a state of perpetual anxiety.
That's horrifying. And Nicole, his daughter, what kind of psychological impact does this have on family members back home?
For families, it's a special kind of hell. They're experiencing what psychologists call ambiguous loss, a situation where a loved one is physically absent but psychologically present. Nicole knows her father is alive, but he's inaccessible, in danger and suffering.
And there's probably very little she can do to help him, which must create incredible feelings of helplessness.
Exactly. Family members often develop symptoms of anxiety, depression, and even PTSD. They're constantly worried about their loved one's safety and health. Nicole specifically mentioned fearing for her diabetic father's life in that crowded jail cell.
I'm guessing sleep becomes almost impossible. Every phone call must trigger panic, wondering if it's bad news.
And many families face the additional burden of secrecy and shame. Some don't tell extended family members or friends what's happened because of the stigma associated with drug crimes, even when their loved one was completely innocent.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. So they're dealing with this massive crisis without a proper support system?
Often, yes. And then there's the financial strain. Families like Nicole's might be spending their life savings on legal fees, international phone calls, wire transfers to provide basic necessities for their loved one in prison, and possibly travel to visit them.
I can see how this would completely consume someone's life. Every waking moment must be focused on trying to help their family member.
Many family members describe putting their own lives on hold, taking leaves of absence from work, neglecting other relationships, and they're constantly navigating complex bureaucracies, often hitting dead ends and facing indifference from officials.
That sounds absolutely exhausting, both emotionally and physically.
It is. And there's another psychological component we haven't touched on, the guilt that family members often feel. Nicole might be thinking, should I have noticed something was off when my dad mentioned this inheritance? Could I have prevented this?
Ugh, that's heartbreaking. Even though it's absolutely not her fault, I can see how that guilt would creep in.
Often experience what's called secondary traumatization. They're not directly experiencing the imprisonment, but they're absorbing much of the psychological trauma through their connection to the victim.
And I imagine there's this constant uncertainty that makes it all worse, not knowing when or if your loved one will come home.
Exactly. The human mind craves certainty. Even bad news can sometimes be easier to process than prolonged uncertainty. But in cases like Rodney's, families often live in limbo for years, unable to move forward, but also unable to grieve and heal as they would with a definitive loss.
What about children? If Rodney has grandchildren, how might this affect them?
Children are particularly vulnerable in these situations. They may not fully understand what's happening, but they absorb the emotional distress of the adults around them. They sense that something terrible has happened to someone they love, and that can create long-lasting anxiety and insecurity.
This is just so awful on every level. Are there support groups or resources for families going through this specific kind of trauma?
Unfortunately, resources specifically for families of blind mules or victims of international scams are limited. There are more general support groups for families of incarcerated individuals, but they don't always address the unique challenges when incarceration happens abroad or results from deception.
So these families are often left to navigate these complex emotions mostly on their own?
In many cases, yes, and that isolation compounds the trauma. This is why raising awareness about these scams is so important, not just to prevent future victims, but also to help create understanding and support for those already affected. Let's talk about prevention strategies, because honestly, while Rodney's story is heartbreaking, there are specific steps people can take to avoid falling victim to blind mule scams.
I think that's so important. What are some of the key warning signs people should watch for?
First and foremost, be extremely skeptical of any unexpected inheritance, especially one that supposedly comes from a foreign country. These scammers know that the prospect of a windfall can cloud judgment.
Right, and I'm guessing that if someone is really meant to inherit something, there are legitimate channels for that to happen that don't involve flying to Africa first?
Absolutely. Legitimate inheritances are handled through proper legal channels, typically with law firms that you can independently verify. They don't require you to travel to sign papers before receiving money, and certainly not to a country that has nothing to do with the inheritance.
So if someone says, your inheritance is in Italy, but first you need to go to Mozambique, that's an immediate red flag.
Huge red flag. Another critical warning sign is when all your expenses are being paid. This might seem generous, but it's actually a tactic to lower your guard. When someone else is arranging and paying for your travel, they control where you go and what you do.
That makes sense. It probably also makes the victim feel like they're not risking anything financially, so what's the harm?
Exactly. And we should emphasize a golden rule. Never, ever agree to transport packages, documents, or anything else across international borders for someone else, even if that person seems trustworthy or is offering payment.
I imagine customs officials hear, "I didn't know what was in the package," pretty frequently, huh?
Unfortunately, yes. And that defense rarely works, regardless of whether it's true. If you're caught with contraband, you're legally responsible for it.
What about verification steps? If someone does get contacted about an inheritance or business opportunity, what should they do before proceeding?
First, slow down. Scammers create artificial urgency to prevent you from thinking critically. Tell the person you need time to consider and research the opportunity.
And I imagine Googling the company or law firm they claim to represent would be a good start.
Definitely, but don't just rely on the contact information they provide. Do independent research to find the official contact details for any company or law firm mentioned. Then reach out directly through those channels to verify the opportunity.
Oh, that's smart. So if someone claims to be from Smith & Jones law firm in London, find that firm independently and call them directly?
Exactly. And if the firm doesn't exist or has never heard of the person contacting you or the inheritance they mentioned, you know it's a scam.
What about consulting with trusted advisors? Who should people talk to if they're unsure?
I always recommend speaking with a financial advisor, attorney, or even local law enforcement before proceeding with any international financial transaction or travel related to an unexpected opportunity. They can often spot red flags that you might miss when you're excited about a potential windfall.
Family members can play a role too, right? I mean, if Rodney had discussed this inheritance thoroughly with Nicole before traveling, she might have spotted something suspicious.
Absolutely. Scammers often discourage victims from telling others about the opportunity, claiming confidentiality, or creating some reason for secrecy. That isolation makes it easier to manipulate the victim.
What about researching the country you're being asked to visit? That seems important too.
Critical step. Always check travel advisories from the State Department before traveling internationally. Some countries have high risks for scams, crime, or detention of foreign nationals. A quick check might have alerted Rodney that Mozambique isn't typically a financial hub where legitimate inheritance paperwork would be processed.
And I'm guessing it's important to be especially careful if you're asked to travel to a country that seems unrelated to the opportunity being presented.
That's a key point. If the connection between the destination and the purpose isn't logically clear, that's suspicious. Why would Italian inheritance paperwork need to be signed in Mozambique? That geographical disconnect should raise immediate concerns.
What about protecting your documents when traveling? Any advice there?
Never let anyone hold your passport or ID documents, even temporarily. Scammers sometimes take victims' passports to prevent them from leaving or to exert control. Always keep copies of important documents stored separately or digitally with a trusted person back home.
Oh, that's really smart. What about if you're already traveling and something starts to feel off?
Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't be afraid to back out, even if you've already invested time or money. Contact your country's embassy or consulate immediately if you feel you're being coerced or if something suspicious is happening.
Are there any specific resources people should know about for verifying these opportunities or getting help if they suspect they're being targeted?
The FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center is a good resource for reporting suspected scams. For inheritance claims specifically, the International Association of Probate Researchers can help verify legitimacy. And before any international travel, register with the State Department's Smart Traveler Enrollment Program so they know where you are.
Those are fantastic resources. Anything else people should consider?
Remember that legitimate opportunities don't require secrecy or rush decisions, and a big inheritance or business opportunity that seems too good to be true almost certainly is. Take your time, do your research, and consult experts before proceeding with anything that involves international travel or financial transactions.
And I guess for our listeners who might be thinking, this would never happen to me, it's worth remembering that these scammers are professionals. They're extremely skilled at what they do.
Absolutely. These aren't amateur operations. They're sophisticated criminal networks that have perfected their techniques over years. They know exactly which emotional buttons to push and how to gradually increase their control over victims.
So even smart, savvy people can fall victim if they're not vigilant.
Exactly. No one is immune to these tactics, especially when they target our hopes, dreams, or emotional vulnerabilities. That's why awareness and prevention are so crucial. Now let's talk about specific resources that can help if you or someone you know suspects they're being targeted by scammers, or if a family member has already become caught in a blind mule situation.
This is really important information, Sue. Where should people turn first if they think they're being approached by scammers?
For Americans, the first point of contact should be the Federal Trade Commission. They have a dedicated website at reportfraud.ftc.gov where you can report suspicious activity. They collect these reports and share the information with law enforcement agencies.
And does the FTC also provide resources for people to educate themselves about scams?
Absolutely. Their website, consumer.ftc.gov, has a wealth of information about different types of scams, including inheritance scams and travel scams, similar to what happened to Rodney. They provide clear guidance on what to watch out for.
What about for situations where someone is already overseas and potentially in trouble like Rodney is?
That's when you need to contact the U.S. Department of State's Overseas Citizen Services immediately. They have a 24/7 emergency line at 1-888-407-4747 if you're calling from the U.S., or 1-202-501-444 from overseas.
What exactly can they do to help in these situations?
While they can't get someone out of foreign legal trouble or act as a legal representative, they can help locate the individual, check on their welfare, provide a list of local attorneys, contact family members, and explain the local criminal justice process. They can also help ensure that detained Americans are treated humanely according to internationally recognized standards.
That's really good to know. Are there any organizations that specifically focus on helping victims of blind mule scams?
The closest would be organizations like Prisoners Abroad, if you're from the UK, or the Fair Trials International organization, which works globally. These organizations provide support to people who have been detained overseas and can sometimes offer specialized guidance for cases involving unwitting drug mules.
What about financial resources? I imagine if a family member is detained overseas, there could be significant legal costs.
You're right about that. The ACLU has resources and sometimes takes on cases involving Americans detained abroad under questionable circumstances. There's also the Detained Americans Support Foundation that can provide guidance and sometimes financial assistance.
Are there any online communities or support groups for families going through this kind of ordeal?
Yes, and they can be incredibly valuable. There's a Facebook group called Families of Americans Detained Abroad, where family members share experiences and resources. The organization Hostage US also provides support for families of Americans held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad.
That's so important. I can't imagine how isolating it must feel to have a family member detained overseas.
It's absolutely devastating. Another resource is just reaching out to your elected representatives, your congressional representative, or senators. They often have staff dedicated to helping constituents with international issues and can sometimes apply diplomatic pressure in cases that appear unjust.
What about resources for verifying if an inheritance claim is legitimate in the first place?
The International Association of Professional Probate Researchers, Genealogists, and Heir Hunters, IAPPR, can help verify inheritance claims. You can also contact the embassy or consulate of the country where the inheritance is supposedly located and ask for guidance.
And what about travel-specific resources? Are there ways to check if a destination might be particularly risky?
Absolutely. The State Department's travel.state.gov website provides country-specific information, travel advisories, and alerts. They rank countries from Level 1, exercise normal precautions, to Level 4, do not travel. Always check this before traveling internationally.
That's really useful. Are there any apps or tools people can use to stay safe while traveling?
Yes, the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program is a free service that allows U.S. citizens traveling abroad to register their trip with the nearest U.S. embassy or consulate. This way, they can contact you in an emergency. There's also the State Department's Smart Traveler app that provides up-to-date information about safety conditions worldwide.
What about for non-U.S. citizens? Are there similar resources for them?
Most countries have equivalent services. For example, Canada has travel.gc.ca, the UK has gov.uk foreign travel advice, and Australia has smartraveler.gov.au. These all provide country-specific travel advice and ways to register your travel plans.
This is all really valuable information, Sue. Is there anything else you'd recommend for people trying to help a family member in a situation like Rodney's?
One more thing I'd emphasize is the importance of working with an attorney who specializes in international criminal law, ideally one who has experience in the specific country where your loved one is detained. The State Department can provide lists of local attorneys, but you'll want to do additional research to find someone with the right expertise.
And I imagine documentation is important too, right?
Extremely important. Family members should keep detailed records of all communications related to the case, including dates, times, names, and summaries of conversations with officials. This documentation can be crucial if you need to escalate the case or seek additional help.
These resources could literally be life-saving for someone in Rodney's situation or for someone who might be targeted for a similar scam.
That's exactly right, Nick. Knowledge and swift action are critical in these situations. The sooner someone reaches out for help, the better the chances of resolving the situation or preventing it entirely. As we wrap up our discussion of Rodney Baldus's tragic situation, I think it's important to summarize the key takeaways from this case so our listeners can protect themselves and their loved ones.
Absolutely, Sue. This story has been heartbreaking but incredibly educational. What would you say are the most important red flags people should watch for?
The first major red flag is any unexpected inheritance, especially one that's overseas or from someone you've never heard of. In Rodney's case, he believed it was from his late wife, which made it seem more credible, but the overseas component should have raised concerns.
That makes sense. And I'm guessing another red flag would be the requirement to travel to a third country that wasn't even related to the inheritance?
Exactly, Nick. Anytime you're told you need to travel to sign papers in person, especially to a country that seems unrelated to the inheritance or business deal, that's a huge warning sign. In legitimate situations, documents can almost always be handled through official channels like embassies or consulates.
And what about the all-expenses-paid travel? That seemed to lower Rodney's suspicions, but it's actually part of the trap, right?
That's one of the most insidious parts of these scams. When someone offers to pay for your travel, it feels like they're investing in you, so it must be legitimate. But criminals view these expenses as a small investment for a potentially huge payoff if they can use you as a blind mule.
I was also struck by how these scammers use time pressure and isolation tactics. They don't give you time to think or consult with others.
That's a critical point, Nick. They create a sense of urgency and isolation. They might tell you the opportunity will disappear or that you need to keep it confidential. This prevents victims from getting outside perspectives that might spot the scam.
So what would you say are the most important prevention strategies our listeners should remember?
First, verify everything independently. If someone claims there's an inheritance, consult with a trusted attorney in your home country before taking any action. Don't rely on lawyers or officials suggested by the people contacting you.
And I'm guessing you should never travel internationally based solely on someone else's instructions, right?
Absolutely not. Before traveling internationally for any business or financial matter, research the country thoroughly using official government resources like the State Department's travel advisories, and always share your travel plans with trusted family or friends.
What about the psychological aspect? These scammers seem to be experts at manipulating emotions.
That's such an important point. These criminals are skilled at finding emotional vulnerabilities. In Rodney's case, they exploited his grief over his late wife. Take a step back if something touches on a deep emotional wound. That's exactly when we're most vulnerable to manipulation.
And I think it's worth emphasizing that no legitimate inheritance or business opportunity will ever ask you to transport items across international borders.
That's a golden rule everyone should remember. Never, ever agree to transport packages, documents, or anything else across international borders for someone else. No exceptions. If someone asks you to do this, it's almost certainly illegal activity.
I'm also thinking about the importance of listening to that gut feeling. Sometimes we sense something is wrong before we can articulate why.
Trust that instinct, absolutely. Our subconscious often picks up on inconsistencies or warning signs before our conscious mind can process them. If something feels off about a situation, it probably is.
What would you say to people who might be thinking, this could never happen to me?
I'd remind them that these criminals are professionals who have perfected their techniques over years. Rodney wasn't naive or foolish. He was targeted by sophisticated criminals who knew exactly which psychological buttons to push. It could happen to anyone.
And finally, it's probably worth remembering that if something sounds too good to be true,
it almost certainly is. Unexpected windfalls, especially from overseas, are exceedingly rare. Apply extra scrutiny to any situation that promises life-changing sums of money with minimal effort on your part.
This case really drives home how devastating these scams can be, not just financially, but in terms of human freedom and family trauma.
Exactly. Rodney's case isn't just about financial loss. It's about a man's freedom, his health, and the devastating impact on his daughter and other loved ones. These aren't victimless crimes. They destroy lives. Well, Nick, I think we've covered everything we can about Rodney's heartbreaking situation. These blind mule scams are particularly devastating because they don't just take money. They can take someone's freedom and potentially their life.
It's truly terrifying to think about. Sitting in a jail cell in Mozambique with diabetes, I can't imagine what Rodney and his family are going through right now.
And that's why we do this show, to help protect our listeners from falling victim to these sophisticated scams. Remember, everyone, no legitimate inheritance will ever require you to travel to sign papers, especially not to a country unrelated to the inheritance.
And please, never, ever agree to transport anything across international borders for someone else, no matter how convincing their story might be or how much they're offering to pay for your travel.
That's absolutely right. And if you're worried about a loved one who might be in a similar situation, don't hesitate to contact your country's embassy or consulate immediately. Time is often of the essence in these cases.
I hope Rodney's story serves as a powerful warning. These scammers are professionals who have perfected their techniques over years of operation. They know exactly which emotional buttons to push.
Exactly. And they're counting on your good nature and trust. So always verify independently, consult with trusted advisors, and remember that if something sounds too good to be true, it almost certainly is.
We want to thank all of you for listening to today's episode of Behind the Scams. We know these stories can be difficult to hear, but knowledge truly is power when it comes to protecting yourself.
We'd also like to thank Mariana vanZeller for her incredible reporting on trafficking networks and for bringing stories like Rodney's to light. She is absolutely awesome.
She is, and she is one brave lady. I applaud her for the excellent reporting she does and the dangers she puts herself through to tell these important stories. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with friends and family who might benefit from this information. Sometimes the best protection is simply awareness. Also, be sure to visit our website at stampoutscams.org for more scam prevention information and news. While you are there, try out our AI chatbot named Sam. He is specifically trained on scam-related data, so you should be able to find an answer to just about any scam-related question you may have.
That's all for today's episode of Behind the Scams. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
And remember, stay safe, stay informed, stay alert, and we'll catch you next time. Bye for now.
Miles, would you please do what you do best and close out this episode of Behind the Scams with that $1 million voice of yours?
That's going to do it for this eye-opening episode of Behind the Scams, folks. I'm Miles. Yes, the velvet voice behind the mic, and by popular demand, now fully animated. You're welcome. Apparently, people wanted to know what kind of hunk hides behind these dulcet tones. And now you get to find out, complete with eyebrows that move and everything. Now, if you were listening carefully, you just heard the terrifyingly true story of Rodney Baldus, a retired Minnesota truck driver whose retirement plans got hijacked by international con artists. What started as a heartwarming inheritance tale turned into a horrifying journey through Mozambique and straight into a prison cell. No happy ending in sight. It's a brutal reminder that scams don't just empty your bank account. They can rob you of your freedom, your health, and your dignity. Rodney's story isn't fiction. It's not exaggerated. It's painfully real. And it's exactly why Behind the Scams exists, to shine a big, glaring spotlight on the underworld of fraud that so often hides in plain sight. So, if you've enjoyed the ride, and by enjoyed, I mean sat there shocked, shouting, "No way!" at your headphones, don't forget that Behind the Scams is part of Stamp Out Scams, a nonprofit scam prevention organization. We rely on your support to keep producing stories that educate, inform, and hopefully keep you and your loved ones one step ahead of the fraudsters. And yes, all donations are tax deductible, because our accountant said so, and we trust them way more than someone promising $3.7 million in an Italian inheritance. You can learn more or make a donation at stampoutscams.org. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And thanks for being part of the scam fighting family. And remember, when in doubt, throw it out, especially if it comes with free first-class tickets to Mozambique. Until next time, stay smart, stay skeptical, and stay behind the scams.